tried really desperately in this speech to do something different with my manner, despite the outrageous things Chris just said. So let's begin with the end of Chris's speech. Apparently, once you've got a vote, once you've got a democracy, it can't go backwards. That's the win the opposition bench gets to own in this debate. What an utter mischaracterisation of how fledgling democracies occur and how the transition to democracy occurs in poor countries, that we could point you to a number of examples. At no point did they explain to us why this democracy would be meaningful in anything other than re-establishing and continuing to perpetuate the existing power structures within that society. There was an utter mischaracterisation of the opposition bench, both of how the transition to democracy occurs and also of how the economies of these states function and how the dictatorships of these states function. I will attempt to have some structure. I apologise in advance if I don't. There were a couple of important concessions in Bisset's speech that I want to outline at the beginning of my speech. First of all, he conceded that money was critical to the development of democracy. So the only real question he asked of our attention in this debate was how much money. Was there a point at which minimum standards had been met sufficiently to enable the kind of democratic change that that bench claimed they would get in this debate? And we recognise it's a hard line to draw, especially in a debate where the optimum level of economic development is. What we would say to you is that there is an optimum level of economic development that does not look like the very basic minimum standards of people not starving to death, which incidentally wasn't being met in a number of the countries that they spoke about. So even by Chris's own analysis in this debate, they didn't meet their criteria for economic development. What we would say it's about not just absolute deprivation, but it's about relative deprivation. And they didn't want to engage at all with this analysis that John provided in this debate. When there is one ethnic group that exists within your country that controls resources, that's incredibly rich in a relative sense to you, it does not matter that you have bread and water. What matters is that you know that control of that state gets you access to the, for example, incredibly large natural resources, the incredibly large amount of money that flows from control over those resources. Whilst you believe there is a significant degree to which you are going to be disadvantaged by another group of people controlling that state, that democracy will never function. This gets us to the question, what do these democracies look like, even if we don't play the kind of low game in this debate and talk about like the fact that they're all going to kill each other, which I'm going to get to in a second. These democracies look like life or death. Whoever wins the first election in these places is a critical indicator of what the likelihood of success of that ethnic group is. And let's talk about Syria as a prime example, where one of the #1 reasons that the Alawites fought so hard to stay in power because they were afraid not just of persecution in the killing sense, but of the huge economic deprivation that that group of people had faced previously within that country. When you do not deal with those underlying issues, that democracy will always be dysfunctional. We would put you to a host of examples of where external forces have been able to establish democracies, quote unquote. Nigeria, the Congo, Somalia, Sudan. People get votes in those places. I kid you not. People vote in elections in those places. The reason why that gets them absolutely nowhere is twofold. First of all, because governments are so unstable due to the fact that those election campaigns are fraught with ethnic division, with killings of people from different ethnic minorities, with campaigns that literally run along the lines of racism and trying to incite violence against other minorities in order to win. So you do not fix, rather you exacerbate those very problems. And the outcome of that, this is what Dom told you in extension, is that you continue the cycle of no economic development in those places, which means even if you eventually get some degree of a stable government, which we do not concede in this debate, that government's hands are tied. That government's incapable of functioning in any meaningful sense because there's no functional economy for which that government can draw resources such that they can implement policy that's actually beneficial to the people on the ground. And here's where I get to my second problem of many with the opposition's case in this debate. What did people want out of this revolution? It's been an utter mischaracterisation of the opposition bench. They said there were to quote Shyaam, there were 14 billion people in Cairo, so obviously that's what people wanted. The 14 billion people in Cairo they pointed to were the people for whom the deprivation of resources was not the most key issue. Those were the people who had most benefited from the economic development. It didn't in any way reflect what was true for the rural poor in those countries who are now even worse off because that economy is in the shit. What was their response to that? Kiran said to us, in general, businesses don't don't like trading with dictators, so actually you don't get the type of economic development that you wanted to point to. Before I explain why that's utter crap, I'll take a point from Kiers.
Gemma, countries like Syria, Yemen and Libya were economic wastelands because dictators have a funny tendency to only entrench themselves and their armies. Where is this mystical middle class for 30 years in power?
We would point you to a number of things on that. First of all, there were plenty of examples where that wasn't true. Let's talk about Libya, which was a developing country where wealth was being redistributed. The idea that dictators never have an incentive to spend money on people is a lie. Let's talk about why they do, in a context in which those people aren't challenging their authority, which is what we saw in Libya for at least a decade before the outcome that recently occurred as part of the Arab Spring, right? Which is to say, Gaddafi felt comfortable in power. He felt like he wasn't going to be challenged. As a result of that, he had an incentive to continue. He had an incentive to spend money on the development of that country. A very similar thing is true, incidentally, for Hosni Mubarak, who spent quite a lot of oil revenue on helping out poor people in Egypt. So it's literally a lie for them to say that it never filters down to economic development. But also, our policy in this debate wasn't reliant on governments being willing to redistribute wealth. We told you investment from external actors is hugely increased when you have some degree of stability, which is what these dictatorships provided. We acknowledge it wasn't the most stable. We would tell you it was 10 or 20 times more stable than the situation they provided. And the reason for that, A, is because often people do like to deal with dictators, because the stability associated with somebody having been in power for 30 years means your investment in that country is actually relatively sound because you know the opinion of that dictator, which is why often dictators, especially in Africa, manage to secure quite lucrative deals with a number of international corporations. But the other reason why they come in is because there are people there who are willing to engage with them in a business sense, and they're not afraid of investing in physical infrastructure in those countries because the things might not actually be bombed. That's the outcome they get you, right? People are never willing to invest in those countries because the likely result of these things, as proven by the Arab Spring, is that those investments will end up in the toilet. At the end of this debate, Mr. Speaker, what people wanted was democracy. We're happy to concede that. What they needed to get there was economic development. That's exactly what the opposition in this debate sacrificed. We're happy to.